Hello you lovely lot, and welcome back to a brand new video here on my theatrical themed YouTube channel. Today, if you couldn't tell by the title, I'm going to be giving you guys my honest thoughts and feelings about Hadestown and its recent opening here on the West End. Now, I saw this Saturday the 24th of February and I saw an evening performance, so I am ready to give you guys the good, the bad and the ugly. So without further ado, let's get into this. First things first, let's give you guys a bit of context. What is the history of Hadestown as a show and what is the plot? So Hadestown began as a very small production back in 2006-2007, where it was pretty much just a bunch of local singers getting together to perform these songs, and that eventually evolved into Hadestown as we know and love it today. The story of Hadestown primarily is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which, if you don't know, is an ancient Greek myth in which Orpheus is tasked with going to the underworld to save his lover Eurydice, and his challenge in getting her back is to just trust that she is following him as he makes his way to the exit of the underworld. This is a very traditional Greek tragedy in this sense. Tragedy, I guess, giving away how it ends. Unfortunately, Orpheus doesn't complete this quest and Eurydice is doomed to spend the rest of her time in the underworld. But what's unique about Hadestown is the fact that it very ambiguously sets when this story is taking place. It's not set in ancient Greece, despite it being an ancient Greek myth. It is set in this rather ambiguous time period. There's nothing concrete said. The music and the costuming is all very 1930s New Orleans, but it's never explicitly stated that that's where it is set. There are other elements of the story brought in as well, such as the myth of Hades and Persephone, but primarily the story does focus on Orpheus and Eurydice. The musical style of this show takes its influences from 1913 New Orleans, and if you're struggling to kind of place that sound, think jazz music, think Princess and the Frog. It's very upbeat, it's very lively music, and I think it complements the setting of the musical beautifully. But with you guys all caught up to speed on what Hadestown is exactly about, without too many spoilers, let's get into the good, the bad, and the ugly of this musical, as always starting with the good. The first thing I have to point out in the good, and I probably sound like a broken record, but of course is going to be the performances. We had Simon Oscarson on as Orpheus, and if you don't know, he is the swing for Orpheus, meaning given that this show literally only opened a week ago, it was probably one of his first performances, and I do think he did a fantastic job. Grace Hodgett-Young as Eurydice, again, was another standout. Her voice was absolutely gorgeous, and I thought suited the role really well. The Fates were another standout for me. The three of them performed beautifully, and their harmonies hit every time, so nothing to fault there. But overall, the cast was fantastic. It was a really diverse cast as well, which is really nice to see. Lots of different people, body shapes, ethnicities, abilities represented on stage, and I did really like that, as I think sadly that's not something we see a lot of in West End casting, so I think it's good that a show like Hadestown is allowing those spaces and those roles to be played by anyone based on your talent and your talent alone, and nothing about the way you identify or how you look, which is brilliant. The next good thing I have to point out is going to be the set. I'll include a few pictures here and there as to what it looked like, and without giving any spoilers away, I thought it was gorgeous. There is a moment in the show where the entire set changes, and that was the moment for me that I was like, this is a good set. This is a good set. Had it not transformed in the way it did, I think I would have been slightly disappointed, and it would have been very meh. But the fact it had that ability to transform, and it came out of nowhere and genuinely had like my jaw on the floor. I was sat there like, oh my god. I think that was really good. When a set has the ability to do that and really catch you by surprise with how dynamic it is, I think is beautiful. Speaking of set, it should also be noted that Hadestown is very well known for the revolve. Now, if you don't know what a revolve is, it's basically a spinning disc on a stage, but Hadestown is very clever because it actually has three separate revolves. They are basically three consecutive circles, each of which can spin independently, which allows for some really interesting staging and the opportunity for great movement on stage, such as walking, etc. But what's even more clever is the central ring of that revolve is a lift, which can be raised and lowered to bring characters on and off the stage, as well as bring different levels to the stage. So I think the way it used and incorporated the revolve was really fantastic. I know a lot of people feel like the West End is kind of overusing the revolve at the moment, but I for one can't get enough of it because it does allow for some really fantastic staging, which I always appreciate. Another thing that is worth pointing out that was in the good category for me, of course, is going to be the band. They sit on stage the whole time the show is happening, and their energy and passion, which you could kind of tell through the way they were playing the music, was fantastic. I liked that they were visible the whole time. I do think in a show like Hadestown, where the music is a very key part of the show, almost a character itself, it is important for those players to be visible to the audience so that we can see where the music is coming from and therefore truly appreciate the talent that goes into playing it. And the final thing in my good category today is going to be a slightly weird one, but it's going to be the ovation the show got at the end. Now, if you, like me, are a frequent flyer at the West End, you will know that 99% of shows now get standing ovations. Whilst I have no problem with every show getting a standing ovation, in fact, I'm usually one of the first people on my feet when a show concludes as a way of showing my appreciation to the cast and crew that have just performed the show. I do think there is something to be said about the fact that some standing ovations feel more like a trickle effect as to, oh, well, the people in front of me have stood up, so I'm going to stand up or else I can't see. Whereas this standing ovation, the minute that final song played, everyone was up on their feet. I've never seen an audience stand up so quickly, and so when I say this was one of the most genuine standing ovations I've ever witnessed, it is very much true, because it was like no one had a second thought. There was no humming and hawing, should I stand up so I can see the stage better? It was like boom, everyone was on their feet, which I think was fantastic because, as I said, the performances were all brilliant and the round of applause was really well deserved. But as you can see, that was a relatively short good section, and I think this is where I'm about to start losing some people, because contrary to all of the reviews my fellow reviewers and theatre critics are giving, Hadestown just was not the show for me. And so with that said, I think it is time to get into the bad. Now, as always, I'm going to caveat this by saying my bad is more a reflection of my personal taste in what I like to see when I go to the theatre, as opposed to a reflection on the hard work and talent that has gone into creating this show, both from the performers and those working behind the scenes. So that disclaimer out the way, let's go over what I didn't love. First thing I will say is the myths that were told, the Persephone and Hades myth more so, but to some extent the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, they were definitely very Americanized, and there's nothing explicitly wrong with that. I just feel as though, as someone who studied ancient history, you know, beyond A level, it's such a shame when the myths get watered down to such basic extents. Particularly the myth of Hades and Persephone. I feel like that is such a nuanced and rich myth. To see it reduced to Hades had a crush on her, took her to the underworld, and Persephone eventually, like, learnt to put up with him. I feel like it is, like I said, so much more nuanced than that, and I feel like the show, because it was telling the Hades and Persephone myth almost consecutively with the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, it kind of left a lot to the wayside and didn't really give the time to explore this myth, which is a shame. As I said at the start of this video as well, this show is sort of rather ambiguously set, and whilst that isn't necessarily an issue, I do think it starts to show its flaws when you have such a strong time period visually. As I said, the costumes were all very 1930s, as was the music and as was the set. And I think when you are giving an audience such a visually strong sense of the time period, to just go, oh, but it's not set anywhere in particular, can sometimes be quite jarring, especially then when you add elements such as mining and building walls and things like that, which are very pertinent to Hades' character, that you're sort of like, hang on a minute, what's going on here? And I think I certainly struggled. There was a big disconnect between them trying to tell the myths versus them trying to tell the period, like the story of the time period, even though there wasn't a time period, if that makes sense. I don't really quite know how to phrase it in a way that like makes much more sense than that. I think there was just a disconnect there. There were some pieces of the puzzle that weren't quite lining up for me. I know other people love this about the show. It just wasn't something that I could fully get behind. And I think as a result of that, I really did struggle to connect with a lot of the characters, which is a real shame. A lot of people in the audience around me were in full-on tears by the time the show ended, and I just really struggled. I didn't feel particularly connected to any of the characters. The only moment that I felt any sort of strong feeling towards it was at the very, very end, when Orpheus is about to exit Hadestown. Eurydice is right behind him, and you're on the edge of your seat going, is he going to turn around? Is he going to turn around? Of course, you know he is, but there is still that little glimmer of hope. That was the only point in the show that I felt really connected to the characters, and I think the show, in my eyes, suffered as a result of it. Another thing, along with the ambiguous time setting of this piece, was also the choice the show made with regards to accents. Now, if you've watched the show on Broadway, you will know that all of the cast have American accents, whereas the decision was made for the UK cast in this West End run to use their natural accents, meaning you have Irish, you've got American, you've got Southern English like me, you've got Northern, all sorts of different local dialects showing up. And that to me just added to the kind of vague setting, if that makes sense. It was quite jarring, and I don't think it helped me when it came to my feeling of being slightly lost within kind of where to set the show in my mind. It made the suspension of disbelief a lot harder for me, and definitely was a little bit too jarring for me to get really sucked into the world. And that was the bad, so now you guys know it is time to move on to the ugly. Now, these are going to be things that maybe you don't have on your bingo card for what Flora is about to complain about the theatre again, but I would like to start by saying the first thing in the ugly category for me is going to be the lyric theatre. Yes, I know, I've decided to have a go at the theatre this time in my ugly category. I'm willing to go on record and say that the lyric theatre is by far my least favourite theatre in London. I've seen multiple shows there. I've seen Six, Peter Pan Goes Wrong, and now Hadestown there, and I cannot get behind it. It is such a drastically shaped theatre that unless you are sat bang in the middle, you feel like the whole theatre is wonky. I'm going to try and pull up a seating chart for you guys so you can have an understanding of what I'm talking about, but the curvature of the theatre is just so drastic that particularly when you are sat in the dress circle, everything feels slightly wonky. We were slightly off to the left-hand side, and as a result, the entire stage looks skewed, and I do think that's such a shame. The theatre is also incredibly hot, not very banked, and the kind of common areas are incredibly crowded, and I think this crowding of the common areas and the heat contributed to the fact that I went into this show very overstimulated. Now, if you don't know me, I have ADHD, and unfortunately, part of that is dealing with being overstimulated sometimes, and I do know when I'm in an overstimulated state of mind, my perception of the show I'm watching can be drastically altered, and so I do think some of my, not negative feelings towards Hadestown, but my less glowing review, shall we say, is a direct result of the fact that I was incredibly overstimulated, and as a result, I couldn't get lost in the world of Hadestown in the way that I could have potentially if I hadn't been in that state of mind. So I will say that I definitely want to give Hadestown another go and give it the opportunity to present itself to me again when I'm in a better headspace. And the second thing in my ugly category is going to be the fact that my audience was predominantly Americans. Now, to catch you up to speed, in case you think I'm about to go on a British people hate Americans train, I grew up in America, so I definitely have like a foot in both worlds. But there is definitely a lot to be said for the fact that Americans tend to enjoy theatre drastically differently to how we do here in the UK. There was whooping every time anyone stepped onto the stage, regardless of whether they'd been introduced before or not. Loud whistling, cheering. There was even a man trying to like call out and interact with the cast at one point. I'm like, bro, this is not a pantomime. What are we doing? I'm not saying we had to be sat there in strict silence, but they were definitely a lot more rambunctious and rowdy when it came to cheering, whistling, and overall heckling of the performers on stage, which was something I definitely wasn't expecting going into it. The final thing in the ugly category for me is going to be the hype around the show. Now, you might be sat here thinking, Flora, why is this in the ugly category? I think the hype around the show was detrimental to it. I went into Hadestown thinking it was going to be this big, grand, amazing, like life-changing musical. It was very reserved and understated and quite quiet in the way it presented itself, and I do think there is definitely a need for that. You can't have every show be this like boom, wow, spectacle of light and colour, and it just wasn't. I think the light and shade is definitely necessary. I think just for me, in the way that Hadestown was hyped up as this amazing musical, what I had and my impressions I had of the show in my head didn't marry up with what I was presented with, and I think as a result I did leave feeling slightly underwhelmed. going back to see it again and knowing what to expect, I do think my opinion of this will change, as sometimes even just knowing what to expect prior to going in can drastically change your opinion of a show. So I'll be intrigued to see if that very much happens. But all that being said, what I do want to say is that, as I said slightly earlier, I definitely do intend on giving Hadestown another chance. I don't think I was necessarily in the right state of mind to be giving it the most objective and fair of reviews. I will say I can certainly see why people absolutely adore it. But there you guys have it. There are my thoughts and feelings on the good, the bad, and the ugly of my recent trip to see Hadestown. As a result of all of this, I ended up deciding to give this show a 3 out of 5 star rating. The thing I've been saying through all of this is that this show just maybe wasn't for me. I can sit here and appreciate it for what it was, and I can understand why other people really adore it. It just wasn't, in terms of my personal tastes, a show that I particularly connected with or feel overly fond of. But I know a lot of you are probably going to disagree with me, so share your thoughts and feelings in the comments. If you're enjoying my theatre reviews like this, make sure you subscribe for more, as we have plenty of fun on the way. We've got Back to the Future the musical, Peter Pan Goes Wrong, and Hamilton just around the corner, and I don't want you guys missing out on that. So like I said, make sure you subscribe. Remember to click like on this video, and as always, my lovelies, remember to stay stagey. I'll see you on the next one. Bye!